Assalamu alaikum. On behalf of the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago, I welcome you to today's Quranic tafsir session. My name is Sylvia Morales, treasurer of Ojalá Foundation. I accepted Islam a little over 10 years ago and have since been an active part of the Latino Muslim community here in the Chicagoland area. We started Ojalá Foundation a couple years ago to give dawah in Spanish to the Latino communities. I will be the moderator for the session tonight. Today we have with us dear respected Sheikha Tahera Ahmad. Chaplain Tahera Ahmad is a dynamic Muslim scholar practitioner who serves as the Director of Interfaith Engagement, Associate University Chaplain, and Associate Chair of the Women's Residential College at Northwestern University. She also serves as faculty at Garret Theological Seminary on the Northwestern campus. She was recognized at the White House as a leading seminary on the, She was recognized at the White House as a leading Muslim woman, and in 2014, she became the first woman to represent the United States at the International Quran competition in Indonesia, where she placed 6th place in the world, mashallah. Her undergraduate education was in biochemistry and graduate work in theology. She studied in the Islamic Chaplaincy and Interfaith Dialogue program at the Hartford Seminary and received graduate certification in the Women's Spiritual Leadership program and a graduate certification in Classical Arabic, and Islamic Studies from Al-Diwan and Al-Azhar Cairo Ijaza certifications in Tajweed, and has taught widely across the USA. We thank our platinum sponsor, Muzaffar Mirza DDS and Associates, our gold sponsors, Downtown Islamic Center and Zakat Foundation, silver sponsors, Family Eye Physicians, Dr. Muhammad Al-Qudari and Dr. Wasia Khaja Ahmed, Alpha Motors, our bronze sponsors, Charming Skin Vein Clinics, Dr. Jauda Aboud, and Muhsen. Inshallah, tonight our Imam will give highlights of Quranic guidance from Surahs 12 Yusuf and 13 A'rad. After the abridged tafsir, we will have a question and answer session where you get to ask your questions in the comment section on your YouTube and Facebook. Let us welcome Sheikha Tahera Ahmad to our live program. Sheikha Ahmad, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Jazakallahu khairan for that very warm welcome. And thank you to all who are tuning in today. I want to thank CIGC and everyone who is behind the scenes in making this happen. I understand that this is something that is occurring throughout all of Ramadan. Every single day, you're able to tune in with CIGC and learn with different scholars in terms of every single chapter of the Quran, the ajza, as well as the surahs. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you some reflections on Surah Yusuf and Surah Ra'd. And it's actually one of my favorite surahs. I'm sure that some of you have an affinity towards this because it is actually one of the few surahs that was revealed in its entirety, and it is truly a story as it unfolds. And many of you are probably already familiar with the story. So what I'm going to do is not going to tell you or retell you the entire story again. What I'm hoping for today, inshallah, is to give you some highlights of and the themes of Surah Yusuf and Surah Ra'd. And inshallah, we're going to begin, of course, with a little bit of the tilawa of the Quran al-Kareem. Ramadan Kareem to all of you. As you know, we celebrate this month primarily because the Quran was revealed in this month. So if you are following us today, you can join us. We are in chapter 12. Inshallah, we're going to recite the first few verses of Surah Yusuf. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألف لام را تلك آيات الكتاب المبين إنا أنزلناه قرآنا عربيا لعلكم تعقلون نحن نقص عليك أحسن القصص بما أوحينا إليك هذا القرآن وإن كنت من قبله لمن الغافلين إذ قال يوسف لأبيه يا أبت إني رأيت 11 كوكبا إذ قال يوسف لأبيه يا أبت إني رأيت 11 كوكبا والشمس والقمر رأيتهم لي ساجدين قال يا بني لا تقصص رؤياك على إخوتك فيكيدوا لك كيدا إن الشيطان للإنسان عدو مبين وكذلك يجتبيك ربك ويعلمك من تأويل الأحاديث ويتم نعمته عليك وعلى آل يعقوب كما أتمها على أبويك من قبل إبراهيم وإسحاق إن ربك عليم حكيم لقد كان في يوسف وإخوته آيات للسائلين صدق الله العظيم اللهم أنس وحشتنا في قبورنا اللهم ارحمنا من القرآن العظيم واجعله لنا إماما ونورا وهدى ورحمة اللهم ذكرنا مما نسينا وعلمنا مما جهلنا وارزقنا تلاوته آناء الليل وآناء النهار واجعله لنا حجة يا رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد صلاة تنجينا بها من جميع الأهوال والآفات وتقضي لنا بها من جميع الحاجات وتطهرنا بها من جميع السيئات وترفعنا بها عندك على الدرجات وتبلغنا بها أقصى الغايات من جميع الخيرات في الحياة وبعد الممات إنك على كل شيء قدير اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي آمين. So that was a short recitation of the beginning of Surah Yusuf. Surah Yusuf, as I mentioned, is one of the few surahs in which the entirety of the surah is revealed at one time. And what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of a background of the surah. And before we begin, I wanted to ensure that those of us who are joining us, we all are at different levels of our understanding of Islamic theology. So just so we're all clear, well, let's go to our slide. I know someone's controlling the background right here. So if we could go to the presentation. To the first slide. Oh, I'm not seeing it on my screen. Okay, I don't know if you guys can see the first slide right now. One second, I just want to make sure. Okay, so I can't see where you guys are on my, like, are you guys on the first slide right now? This is for the tech people. There we go. Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, so again, the sources of Islam, and when we talk about the tradition, it's important to understand that within the Sunni tradition and the Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah, as you all know, the Quran is something that we rely on, right, in terms of our main source. It's 6,236 verses, depending on, how you count the verses. And then the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which are, of course, the narrations of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We can go to our next slide. I wanted to share that one of them important, and can we put it into the main, can we pull up the entire slide? Like in the slide present. Yeah, if you could go to the full slide, please. Slide share. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. All right, let's go to our next slide. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. The next slide, please. If you could go to the next slide. And slide share. Oh. I can't see the slides anymore. Okay, well, okay. I think we're having some technical difficulties. That's okay. What I wanted to share is that basically there are multiple tafasir that we can be talking about when we think about where do we pull our sources from, right? So today, when I reflect on Surah Yusuf, I'm reflecting on several tafasir, and the slide actually was going to show you some of the different ulama who have already, of course, written about Surah Yusuf. And so one of them, for example, is Fakhruddin al-Razi, rahimahullah. Technically, he's considered, between 854 CE to about 925 CE. And then Imam Qurtubi, of course, Ibn Kathir, you've heard of that name before. And then Imam Suyuti, rahimahullah. I wanted to be able to go to my next slide. Are we able to do that? Yeah, so go back one more, please. That's fine. We could stay where we are. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so here are different ulama that actually have reflected on this. So I don't want to just present to you, my own understanding of Surah Yusuf. Of course, we always think about some of what our scholars have said about it, but I will also do some of the reflection in terms of what we call tadabbur, right? Like when we think about what are some of these verses, how are they speaking to us? So I wanted to include that, yes, as scholars of the tradition, we of course look to our texts and our traditional texts. But today we're also going to be thinking a little bit about what does this surah mean for us, right? How does this touch us? So let's go to our next slide. For those of you who are, kind of like the sarf and nahu geeks, so to speak, right? People who are really like into it. There's a really interesting text called the Mus'af, which actually is the i'rab of Surah Yusuf. So for those of you who are kind of like, what, I want to get into this surah in a grammatical sense, there's actually a really neat text that several of us who've been to a traditional madrasa study, and it actually gives you the i'rab, which is of course a technical term I'm not going to get into, but I just wanted to put this text out there as well. It is fascinating. It actually takes you through the entire Surah Yusuf, and then it tells you why, for example, something is in the state of nasab or jar or in things of that nature. Let's go to our next slide. So let's first put this into perspective. We know that the Quran was revealed in 23 years. Surah Yusuf, many ulama believe that it was revealed towards the latter part of the Meccan period, and it was pretty much before the Prophet ﷺ migrates to Medina Sharif. Now, why am I putting this in context for you? Because it gives us an understanding of what we call asbab al-nuzul, meaning the reason of the revelation, so to speak. Surah Yusuf is considered the 53rd chapter to be revealed. So I know when you guys open the Quran, you see it as the 12th, right? But actually, in terms of the revelation order, it's considered somewhere around the 53rd, and it has 111 verses, as you know. But really, the important things that you should note are in the next slide. Please go ahead to our next slide. This surah was revealed, according to many ulama, at the time of what is considered the Am al-Huzn, or the year of sorrow. what happens in this year? Basically, the Prophet ﷺ and the community, as you may have heard, was really at the brinks of torture. They were, at some narrations record that they were eating off of leaves. They really were being boycotted, right, by the elite of Quraysh. And Khadija radiallahu anha passes away during this year. The uncle of Rasulullah ﷺ passes away, Abu Talib. And the incidents that happen around this time are also Ta'if. The Prophet ﷺ is ridiculed to the extent where little kids actually take stones and hurt the Prophet ﷺ, where he is actually bleeding. So imagine, this surah is being revealed at a time where the Prophet ﷺ is at his lowest. Like, he describes that this is one of the lowest times of his life. Aisha radiallahu anha asks him once, the Prophet ﷺ, about what was one of the most difficult or lowest points of your life, and he says, the ridicule he felt in Ta'if was one of those incidents. And of course, losing the love of his life, Khadija radiallahu anha, and of course he has wives later, but really this was his rock. Khadija radiallahu anha was his rock. And then with the death of Abu Talib, as many of you know, that protection, so to speak, from in terms of the tribal community, that was lost too. So this is a time when the Prophet ﷺ is truly in a state of sadness, and Surah Yusuf is meant to uplift him in a way, right? So some ulama say that this surah was revealed to say to him, well, you're at a down point right now, but guess what? There are other prophets before you, and they also went through deep, deep struggles. And so Surah Yusuf is that example of the struggle. So let's go to our next slide. So again, the purpose of revelation, if someone was asking, it would be motivation for struggle, right? The struggle. And that could be, again, how do we understand this surah? What is this supposed to give us? It is supposed to give us a sense of motivation during our own struggles. And it is also the ta'wil of a hadith, right? It is to understand events around us, right? So Yusuf alayhi salam was given this very special gift from Allah Ta'ala to be able to interpret dreams. And you're going to see this in this surah. And then some ulama say it was also because the Quran itself, as I just recited, says that this was to answer the question of the sa'ilin. There were people who were asking this question. Again, some ulama say that this was in specific to a tribe of Jews who was asking the Prophet some questions about Yusuf alayhi salam and Yaqub alayhi salam. All right, now our next slide. So again, this is basically the verse, right? That Allah Ta'ala is sharing with Rasulullah ﷺ in Revelation that this is basically the story, and we're revealing it to you. And of course, in the entirety, in the way we understand it, it wasn't understood in that way before. Our next slide. The first verse is one of the verses considered of huruf muqatti'at, right? So you guys have seen this reoccur over and over again in the Quran. These verses, right, are not necessary. We do not say that we know the actual meaning of these verses. There are some that ulama have kind of contemplation about, but what's important to know is that the rest of Surah Yusuf, of course, has a very kind of deep understanding based on the story. But the first 3 letters are not something that we can say that we actually know the exact meaning of. Our next slide. So I'm not going to go through every single verse. We don't have time for that. But what I want to give you all is that there are 7 major themes of Surah Yusuf. One is, of course, dream interpretation. And there are ulama who take a lot of time and effort, both female and male scholars, to study dream interpretations. I am actually now, not one of them. I don't necessarily, know how to do a dream interpretation, so don't reach out to me for that at all. I actually just got a little message there. Envy, jealousy, betrayal by kin. One of the highlights of Surah Yusuf for all of us is to remember that betrayal is a part of life. It happens. And unfortunately, when it happens by those who are closest to us, who are our family or who we consider our closest of in kin, that hurts the most, right? So imagine, I told you, Rasulullah ﷺ is at the point of his life where he is truly, really sad. And then Allah Ta'ala reveals to him this beautiful story in which some of the most painful experiences happened to this prophet, Yusuf alayhi salam. Why? Because of the jealousy and envy and betrayal of the people closest to him. Another theme is lust versus piety and the concept of ego. And where you're going to see a slide on that, this idea of nafs al-ammara, nafs al-mutma'inna, and nafs al-lawama. Abandonment and solitude, that Yusuf alayhi salam actually chose sometimes to be alone, to be in a state of solitude, right? So in some ways he was abandoned when he didn't want to be, but then in sometimes he actually said, you know what? I'm okay just by myself, and I need some time for myself. And it's better for me to be by myself than to be surrounded by people who are going to cause tribulations, right, for me. Tawakkul and tadabbur. Deep tawakkul in Allah Ta'ala. It shows you how Yaqub alayhi salam, the father of Yusuf alayhi salam, and Yusuf alayhi salam are both relying on Allah Ta'ala. And as the story unfolds, right, you can see that each time that he's going through the different struggles, he has tawakkul in Allah Ta'ala. He also has something called tadabbur, right, which is trying to think of, okay, deeply understanding a situation and then using it to advance oneself. And you'll see what he does, Yusuf alayhi salam, to make his own situation better by asking the Malik to make him the governor of Commerce, right? And that will come a little bit later. Then beautiful patience. This surah is known for a particular expression, right? It's fasabrun jameel, right? You're going to hear Yaqub alayhi salam say fasabrun jameel. And this is a very particular form of patience. And it encompasses this idea of having mercy, trust, forgiveness, salah, prayer, this idea of tadabbur, and then of course love. There's deep love that Yaqub alayhi salam still continues to have for his sons, for his family, to reunite them. And then of course this surah has some very good du'as, and those du'as are of Yusuf alayhi salam and of course of Yaqub alayhi salam that we should learn, and inshallah we should practice them in our own times of difficulty and to connect with Allah Ta'ala. Our next slide. So when we talk about the dream interpretation, what is the dream, right? The dream is Yusuf alayhi salam, and here's the beginning opening scene, right? And this is what I love about the surah, is that it's almost like one scene closes and then another opens, right? So in the first scene, what's going on? Yusuf alayhi salam says to his father, Yaqub alayhi salam, you know, ya abati, which is a very endearing form of saying father, inni ra'aytu ahada ashara kawkaban wash-shamsa wal-qamara ra'aytuhum li sajidin, that I have seen the 11 stars and the sun and the moon basically worship, like in a state of sujud to him, right? And Yaqub alayhi salam says, oh my son, don't go tell this to your brothers, right? And then he also says, like, shaitan is basically going to cause a sense of deviance, right? So there's this beautiful dream in the beginning. It's going to unfold at the end of the surah, but it's important to note that Yusuf alayhi salam first tells his father, and the father says, don't go and tell everyone you dream. And we actually know this from the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that if you have a good dream, you should share it. If you don't have a good dream, you're actually not supposed to share it, especially with those whom you do not believe are well wishers for yourself. Okay, next slide. The idea that Allah Ta'ala says that وَيُعَلِّمُكَ مِن تَأْوِيلِ الْحَدِيثِ. Now, it's not just in terms of dream interpretation. Some ulama say that the ta'wil of a hadith is occurrences. So think of it in the context of what I said to you earlier. Why is the surah being revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Things are going to unfold for you too, O Prophet, right? Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah Ta'ala is sharing with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam the story of Yusuf alayhi salam and the unfolding of the things happening around you. They're going to have meaning in them. There is a purpose to them. That's the idea, right? So some of that, of course, is coming through these dreams, but a lot of it is just these occurrences and things that happen to us. And the idea is to be patient through them, and that there will be an opening for every single one, inshallah, of us as well. That we have to have a sense of deep understanding that Allah Ta'ala is going to teach us and guide us through all of these different occurrences that happen in our life. Our next slide. Next slide. The envy of kin, they put him in a well. You guys all know this. And what's subhanAllah beautiful is one of my teachers, I remember, told me that he said, Tahera, every single human being at one point in their life or another will face some kind of darkness of their own pit, like that they're thrown into, right? And that maybe, you know, we know the story of Yunus alayhi salam, where he's in the darkest of the darkest part of the deep ocean inside a whale. And then he says what many Muslims call the ayat karima, or la ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu min al-zalimin. Yusuf alayhi salam is thrown into this deep well. He doesn't know what's going to happen next. And it is his feeling of abandonment, right? And what I want to share here with you as a reflection is, maybe you may be in a place there right now, feeling that way, that you are in that place where no one understands you, or that you are in a place of darkness and there's no other openings in your life. But we know that through the story of Yusuf alayhi salam and what is taught to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam by Allah Ta'ala in the Quran is that there will be openings, right? So the envy of the jealousy of the brothers throws him into the deepest part of this, you know, well. However, there is an opening for him. Our next slide. So why were they envious though, right? That's the question. They say that وَنَحْنُ عُصْبَةٌ, right? وَإِذْ قَالَ لَيُوسُفُ وَأَخُوهُ أَحَبُّ إِلَىٰ أَبِينَا مِنَّا وَنَحْنُ عُصْبَةٌ إِنَّ أَبَانَ لَفِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. Look at what they're doing. They're blaming their father instead of actually recognizing that they're jealous. But what they're saying is, we should be the ones who are more beloved because we are the usbah, right? Like we are the ones who should be closer. But as you all know, this word usbah and the idea of asabiya is forbidden, right? The Prophet said that he came to actually dismantle that. So part of what the surah is also teaching us is not to have these kinds of different, alliances that then disunite the functionality of the ummah, so to speak. All right, our next slide. So Yaqub alayhi salam, he is a prophet, right? And here's what's interesting. He knows the brothers are up to something. He knows his sons, but he lets them still take Yusuf alayhi salam. He tells them, I know what's going to happen. You're going to, basically a wolf is going to, I fear that a wolf is going to eat him, right? And what's unique is they don't come back and give him another reason, right? Like, think about this for a second. Like, just pause for a second. And I'm sure you guys have heard this story so many times. If you were going to go do something wrong and someone told you, I don't want you to do this because I know that a wolf is going to eat, Yusuf alayhi salam, right? But you still go do that exact same thing and you come back and you say the exact same thing versus saying something completely different, right? It teaches you a little bit about the psychology of what's going on in the brothers as well, that they chose to say the exact same thing to Yaqub alayhi salam that he actually feared. Why? Some ulama say because they knew he's a prophet, right? He's in the know of what's going on. Others say, well, they just wanted to reiterate that, we would never do something like this, and they're trying to reconnect with their father's love. But really, it goes back to how beautifully Yaqub alayhi salam deals with the situation, right? He says, okay, I know what's going on, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to unfold all of this. But he's still a father. He's still he's grieving. He's so sad. According to some narrations, he's so sad that he actually loses his eyesight, right? And that the qamis of Yusuf alayhi salam is returned to him at the end of the story, and that he's able to that it brings his eyesight back, right? And that's a whole different conversation we can get into. But it's important to note that Yaqub alayhi salam's role in this as a father figure is very important, but he's still a human. He's still grieving. Okay, next slide. So it's not just the betrayal of kin, it's also of his adopted family, and he's also forgotten by friends. Because what happens? Can we go to the next slide? We know that the people who find him in the well, they actually sell him to another, basically, caravan. And so many ulama actually point this out, right? This verse, وَشَرَوْهُ بِثَمَنٍ بَخْسٍ دَرَاهِمَ مَعْدُودَةٍ. Yusuf alayhi salam, who later becomes someone who is in charge of the commerce of Egypt, right? So he's going to have a lot of agency over money, right? He's sold for darahima ma'duda. So later he's going to become somebody who oversees a whole lot of dirhams, but he's sold for darahima ma'duda. So the reflection point here is he's he's at a point where the value, right? Like the value of what is his human worth, right? Is being reiterated, that it is not what people consider you to be valuable. It is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considers and the relationship you have with him. So even though he's sold for a couple of dirhams, later he is in charge of, a multitude, right? Like of money or financial wealth. All right, on our next slide. So and he's sold, right? The caravan takes him, and it is again, there's different versions of this, of exactly how it happens, but the Malik of basically you would say the governor, he basically takes him in. And then the Imra'a, or the wife of this Malik, basically desires him, right? And what's really unfortunate about this situation is that the first betrayal is, of course, by his own brothers, and then the second one is by those who take him in. It's almost like his adopted family. So she basically, the verse goes that meaning she wants him against his own will. She closes the door and says, "Hay talak," and he says, "Qala ma'adallah." And this is something that I want to reflect on, is that when we are in that state where we know that there is something that is truly like that boundary you're not supposed to cross, you are supposed to remind ourselves, right? And something we say is ma'adallah, right? We seek refuge in Allah Ta'ala. And he says, "Innahu rabbi ahsana mathwaya." Like the maqam with my Lord is going to be the better, right, than what I'm trying to do right now. And innahu la yuflihu dhalimun. And he's actually calling her a zalim in this state, right? Because he understands that, now think of the status of these two people, right? He is technically in a lower status than her, and she's someone who's more privileged in this particular situation, right? And he basically is reminding us all, though, right? Regardless of whether this is a male or female kind of issue, I think what's important in this verse is that when you have when you're in a place of privilege or power, that is what actually can be a cause to causing dhulm on someone. Okay, our next slide. And here's what's also very interesting about these verses. It says, وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهَا. So actually, the in one of the rules of recitation for this verse, you're not supposed to actually just say وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهَا. You're actually supposed to take a little pause there. وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ, or you could say هَمَّتْ بِهِ and then take a pause and say وَهَمَّ بِهَا. Why? Because this actually is saying that she was interested, determined towards him, wanted him, so to speak. And then Allah Ta'ala says that he would have thought about her. However, لَوْلَا أَرَّأَهَا بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. This is what's important, is that he was still human. He could have took that step, but he doesn't. وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَرَّأَهَا بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. That Allah Ta'ala showed him his clear signs, and there's difference of opinion on what that burhan actually is, but I wanted to highlight that as well. Okay, our next slide. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly because of the sake of time. What happens after that? Basically, she, I'm sure you all know, the qamis is ripped from the front. There's a person who actually mediates between them, and he says, you know what, if the qamis is ripped from the front, it's basically her fault, and if it's ripped from the back, it's his fault. And what's important, I think, to note here is that the women who are around her, or this Imra, as they refer to her as, some say, okay, her name was Zulayqa, but what's important is that she felt a sense of guilt, but she was also trying to say to the women who were accusing her that, hey, have you guys seen him? Have you actually seen what he looks like? And so that's what's really interesting, is there's this beautiful scene where these women are brought, and she actually stages the whole thing, right? And they say, Hasha lillahi ma hadha bashara. We can go to the next slide. That they actually see him and they cut their hands. But she continues to persist, right? And that's when Yusuf alayhi salam makes a dua and says, I prefer solitude. So he goes to jail, but at his own preference in a way, because he says, you know what, I don't want to be out here if this is what it's going to cause me over and over again. Like he knew that if he continued to stay out there, that power and privilege would work against him. So he basically makes a dua, and Allah Ta'ala then makes a way for him into the next phase and to the next scene, so to speak. And so we'll go to our next slide.
Sheikha Tahera, really quick, just a brief reminder that you have about 8 minutes, at which point to conclude your discussion, at which point we'll take a brief Q&A.
Okay, great. So big questions. Why did Yusuf alayhi salam prefer imprisonment? Because it actually was going to, that solitude was actually going to be better for him at that time. And what happens in prison? He meets these two men. They're called Sahib al-Sijn in the Quran, and they have dreams. And I'm not going to go into the full story of that. But what's important in that prison is that during that time, one of the Sahib al-Sijn actually goes out and tells the king about him, right? So when Yusuf alayhi salam actually, I'm sorry, not the king, but basically the governor or the Malik, so to speak, and he comes out and he's able to, the idea of the 7 cows eating, the 7 that are the skinny cows, right? And they're going to have 7 years of good kind of agriculture and then 7 years of drought. Yusuf alayhi salam uses this particular ability to help the Malik, right, during this time, and says, hey, why don't you make me in charge of ensuring that I can dispense all of the finances that are necessary, as well as basically the resources. So here's where many of the ulama say that, if you know you're good at something and you are able to take on something, that it's important for you to not self-advocate, right? Like the Quran is actually teaching us that when you know that you have a gift, to utilize it, right? That's what we're learning here, is if he doesn't do that, then he wouldn't have had the opportunity to continue to excel. So yes, of course, we know that Allah Ta'ala is the one who is ultimately in charge, but as Surah Ra'd, which is the next surah, right? There's a famous verse in Surah Ra'd that says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. So we also have to take a sense of agency, and Yusuf alayhi salam teaches us that. Okay, our next slide. We'll just go to our next. So here's the big important thing. The Imra'a of the Aziz, some say Zulayqa, basically says after he comes back from prison, she basically acknowledges that she was at fault. And she presents this idea of, she says, وَمَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي إِنَّ النَّفْسَ الْأَمَّارَةُ بِالسُّوءِ إِلَّا مَا رَحِمَ رَبِّي. That she recognizes that there's this concept, right, of nafs al-ammara. So we are constantly in a state of maybe doing what's right and what's wrong, and we have to actually be able to take over that sense of our, some ulama say it's called the lower ego, right? But when you are able to come to a point of taking control of the things that you know that are bad for you, right, our bad habits, then you have to understand that we come to a point of nafs al-mutma'inna, right? And that's in Surah Al-Fajr as well. Ya ayyatuha an-nafs al-mutma'inna irji'i ila rabbiki radiyatan mardiyah fadkhuli fi ibadi wadkhuli jannati, right? That nafs al-mutma'inna is a state of tranquility that we should all try to be in, but we're constantly battling our own selves, right? And it could be because, like, for me, I know it's like going to the gym, right? I'll just share it with y'all. I'm like, oh, it's Ramadan, and like, I was trying to like get back to the gym, but like I have to be able to recognize that about myself. And so nafs al-ammara mutma'inna is not just about like, oh, it's about just like these major sins. It's literally our ability to reconnect with ourselves and do what's right versus wrong. Okay, let's go to our next slide. I think we'll go to the next one. I'll try to sum it up all together. All right, keep going. Keep going. Okay, so at the end, the brothers come back, as you all know, and they see Yusuf alayhi salam. He knows it's them. they, of course, don't know it's him. He keeps the youngest, Binyamin, and he sends them back to the father, right? And he basically forces them to tell the father that Binyamin stole, right? And Yaqub alayhi salam knows that his son Binyamin is not going to steal, right? However, he has sabrun jamil. He's continuously tested over and over again. So let's go to our next slide. And what is that? Beautiful patience in this surah comes from having mercy to those around you, having a trust in Allah Ta'ala, forgiving, right? There's a huge element of forgiveness in this surah, regardless of what the brothers did. But here's the thing, Yusuf alayhi salam didn't just let them off the hook, so to speak. So that's another major, I think, reflection of this surah that I would like to share with you, is that when someone wrongs you, it doesn't mean that you have to completely forget everything that they did, right? Forgiveness is very different than forgetting something. So he actually puts them through their own trial, right? Like the oldest brother actually stays back, and Binyamin actually stays back, and he tells Binyamin, like, I'm your brother, but he still puts them through a sense of deep understanding that, hey, what you did was not cool, right? He doesn't just forgive them and says, okay, everything is all dandy. He says, like, that's not okay what you did. And he forces them to go back to the father this time. Remember, the first time they go to the father, and they're just like, oh yeah, a wolf ate, Yusuf. This time when they go back to their father, it was not easy for them to just say, your son stole. Because now there's a deeper sense of responsibility that they have. They know how much their father has been grieving. So in essence, Yusuf alayhi salam doesn't let his brothers off the hook, so to speak. But because when forgiveness truly happens, and they are asking for forgiveness as well, they have to acknowledge what they did, the pain that they caused. And if they don't understand the pain that they caused, then they're going to continue to do the same thing over and over again. Okay, our next slide. I know I'm coming to so du'as, right? I said that I'll close out with the idea that these, in particular, Surah Yusuf has several du'as. The one that I connect to deeply is أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إنما أشكو بثي وحزني إلى الله وأعلم من الله ما لا تعلمون, right? He says, Yaqub alayhi salam, that indeed I complain of my beth, which is a deep sense of grief, and my sadness only to Allah Ta'ala. And it's a beautiful du'a of Yaqub alayhi salam. Our next slide. And then, of course, beautiful du'a of Yusuf alayhi salam. فاطر السماوات والأرض أنت ولي في الدنيا والآخرة. Actually, it begins with ربي قد آتيتني من الملك وعلمتني من تأويل الأحاديث فاطر السماوات والأرض أنت ولي في الدنيا والآخرة توفني مسلما وألحقني بالصالحين. Beautiful dua. I think it's something that if one of your Ramadan goals, if you want to put it in there, it's totally up to you. But I think it's a beautiful dua that Yusuf alayhi salam asks Allah Ta'ala to give him a sense of protection by giving him good people that he can always be with, right? That's one of the morals of the story, I think, is to be surrounded by good people and find those people that you can trust, because betrayal truly is something that is very hurtful. Okay, our next slide. And again, it's this idea of taqwa and patience during hard times. Our next slide. I know that I was supposed to talk a little bit, we could go to the next slide. These are just some text. Surah Ra'd main concept that I'm going to share with you, could you please go to the next slide, is these are some of the, and again, this is being recorded, so you guys can go back and listen to some of this. But the main thing of the theme of Surah Ra'd is Allah Ta'ala does not change the state of a people except if they actually take the initiative to change themselves. In our next slide. So when we think about this verse, and when we think about Ramadan, I would like to conclude with this idea, right? That our deeds in Ramadan, they don't have to be like these big, huge goals, right? They can be something that you feel are small, consistent. And so I'll end with that final slide, which is the hadith of Rasulullah, our next slide, that Aisha radiallahu anha narrated, that good deeds can be small, right? And the most beloved are adwamahuma wa in qalla. That even if they're small, it doesn't really matter, but they have to be consistent. Of course, if you have a really big goal, that's really awesome. But Ramadan, again, means to do what? It literally comes from the root word to take a metal and put it into scorching heat so that it purifies that metal. This is a time period for us to be able to go back to the Quran. And if whatever surahs that you relate to the most, like if you relate to Surah Yusuf, go back to Surah Yusuf, recite that again. If you are trying to build some form of relationship with the Quran, that would be, ideal, and start with something small. And then finally, Ramadan is also about relationships. And that's what Surah Yusuf highlights. Rasulullah SAW, as I mentioned, was in one of his lowest points of his life. And then Surah Yusuf is revealed to him. It's a beautiful story. It was partially really to uplift him, to give him a sense of, understanding that there are other prophets who have gone through some deep struggles. And inshallah, if I've presented to you some basic themes that you can walk away with or learn from, alhamdulillah. If I said anything that was not correct, please forgive me. It came from myself. And may Allah Ta'ala allow us to use Ramadan with the best manner possible and grant us the blessings in Ramadan, inshallah, and protect us all. Ameen.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikha Tahera, for those beautiful reminders. I do understand that we were crunched for time, and I would be really interested to hear more from you regarding Surah Yusuf. MashaAllah, you have such great insights on that surah. We really appreciate that. If there's any way you could look into sharing your slides, I know myself and other members of the audience would greatly appreciate that. Now I'd like to go ahead and take a little bit of time to answer some questions that we've received from the audience. The first question is, death of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was in 632 current CE, and the first tafsir of Tabari was 838 to 923. 632 to 838, obviously we see that time gap. How do we know original conversations from Prophet ﷺ were passed on subsequently and documented? Couldn't they have been distorted? It's the same story as with Christianity. If we question the Christians, why not our own?
Okay, that's actually a really interesting question. So I think what's important to understand is that when we think about texts that are actually canonized, and what I mean by that is when there's a recording of anything that's happening and someone is actually writing things down, that and being presented as an actual literary work is different than someone actually recording what's going on and memorizing that. So our tradition is part also, I want to remind, I think it was Munawar who asked the question. Is that, did I say the name right? Okay. Yes, it's actually a really good question in terms of, I think what you're asking, what I'm understanding is you're saying, shouldn't we be critical, right? In terms of making sure that whatever knowledge is coming to us is accurate as well. So you have to understand that we don't just have written works, we also have something called an oral tradition, right? Now, you may ask, and your question could also be, well, or a follow-up to that is, well, even if it was oral, at what point did it actually get placed into a text and then revised or understood by other scholars around them? So I think what's important to understand, Munawar, is I understand what you're saying, that, well, some of these texts weren't actually written and recorded until later, but simultaneously, what you also have to remember is that the hadith tradition is, something that cannot be taken lightly in terms of how it's been preserved, right? I agree that there are differences of opinion in a hadith versus, of course, the ayat of the Quran. But you also have to remember that the oral tradition process was also in place. So if, for example, someone actually was doing a narration, not only was the narration consistently asked about, it was also the rawi, right? And the background of the rawi. And there was a very meticulous process that was in place to ensure that whatever is being shared is accurate. It meets certain criteria. So while I agree with what you're saying, Munawar, which is we need to constantly check and check on our own history and be able to understand what was accurate and what wasn't. What I'm offering you is, well, that actually was happening, even before things were being solidified as an actual text, is our tradition is unique in that sense because of the massive amounts of people who were considered narrators and then had actually memorized those. And then of course you have, the significance of Imam Bukhari rahimahullah and others who then canonized their own texts, but then that gave a leeway to the other mufassirin who used to actually use that as part of their documentation, if that makes sense. And we can talk offline too. I think that's an excellent question. Thank you for asking.
Jazakallah khair for that response. One other question from our audience is, I think there was a little bit of a confusion with the term used. So they're saying, what did the brothers of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam refer to themselves as? Uzba? Sorry, I'm not familiar with that term is the question.
Yeah. So, okay, thank you, Bina, for asking that question. Actually, we could totally talk offline too, Bina, because I know that this is more of gonna go into like Arab al-Quran and then also Lisan al-Arab, like in terms of what Usba actually meant. I was trying to express that when the brothers are using this term, there are different opinions of the scholars of what did it actually mean when they say, like, why isn't the father basically giving us more preference over Yusuf and then of course Binyamin? And they themselves use the word usba. And what I was trying to say is that that term actually comes up later in a hadith as well, and this idea of the kind of nationalistic tribalism that exists, that's what I was actually trying to draw some parallels to in terms of where we are today, right? In terms of what is the vision or the spirit of the vision of the Quran for the ummah of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It's not to go into our own kind of tribalistic ideas around, or by tribalistic I mean like our own kind of versions of what we think is right, and defending our own understanding to the extent where it doesn't actually allow for a multitude of understandings on a matter, but always being like, no, we're always right. And the Prophet specifically actually forbade this type of the asabiya that exists, and it's really goes actually back to this whole idea of racism, right? It's originally, many ulama say that the asabiya actually is this elitism, right? It's this elitism of, oh, I'm better than so and so, right? And that existed within the way the brothers thought about themselves versus Yusuf alayhi salam and Binyamin.
Jazakallah khair. And here is our final question for this evening, which is, how do you practice patience?
Did that question come from my father? Just kidding. Is he like online somewhere, or my mother? They're like, oh, let's ask her this question. Subhanallah. Mashallah. This is a very good question, and I'll be vulnerable and raw here. I try my best to, of course, go back to the Sunnah of Rasulullah, Sayyidina Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And I think one of the things that I find from the Sunnah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that's been very beneficial for me is anytime that I feel that I'm like really, someone's wronging me or I'm feeling betrayed, like that's one of the themes of the surah, is to take a pause, just to take like a deep pause and breathe. And this is something, of course, as a chaplain, as a mental health professional, I practice as well and recommend, is just to take a pause and to breathe. And what this allows, I think, is, one of the Prophet also recommends, right? If you're standing, sit. If you're sitting, lay down. Sometimes a sip of water, of course, when you're fasting, you can't do that. But it's really taking a pause. So you see this in the Sunnah of Rasulullah as well, is the first thing is to take a pause. And that's actually opposite of if you're depressed though. So when you're trying to be patient through sadness and then which could lead to a form of depression, it's actually the Sunnah is recommended is to sit up, right? Is to sit up. Because we know in terms of the brain function, serotonin is also released, right? And we know this actually from studying lobsters. And this is a whole different kind of undergrads like biochem, right? So I get interested in that kind of stuff. But the point is that patience is a process and people need to do different things. But I think where it could start is taking a pause, breathing, allowing the self to reflect on whatever it is that has happened that is causing that sense of pain, and to really think about what immediately, so you can only have like, spheres of control. So what's immediately something that you could do to allow yourself to engage in that particular conversation or situation in a beneficial manner, right? So taking a pause, breathing, doing some of the things from the Sunnah of Rasulullah, of course, and we're in a kind of theological setting here, so that would be the one of the things I would recommend, and really looking at big picture, right? So sabrun jameel of Yaqub alayhi salam is looking at big picture, right? He always kept the big picture in mind, and all the little trials and tribulations that happen in his life, he knew that there's something that Allah Ta'ala is going to bring out of all of this, right? So Yusuf alayhi salam then becomes, basically the governor of Corinth of all of Egypt. And he's able to help people in the time of drought, in the time when they needed him the most, right? That's big picture. So I would recommend taking many steps towards the process in your own life that would allow you to engage in a productive way, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair again, Sheikha Tahera, for your time, as well as everybody who has joined us online. Thank you for watching the program, brought to you by the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago. We thank our platinum sponsor, Muzaffar Mirza DDS and Associates, our gold sponsors, Downtown Islamic Center and the Zakat Foundation, our silver sponsors, Family Eye Physicians, Dr. Muhammad Al-Qudari and Dr. Wasia Haja Ahmed, as well as Alpha Motors. And of course, our bronze sponsors, Charming Skin Vein Clinic, Dr. Jauda Aboud, and as well as Muhsen. CIOGC works extremely hard to serve our community. CIOGC continues to address needs of the Muslim community through local initiatives. These require resources from people volunteering their time and their donations. Donate and make a difference. Please donate to CIOGC at ciogc.org/donate. Again, that was ciogc.org/donate. Inshallah, tomorrow we will have Mufti Minhajuddin Ahmed giving an abridged tafsir of Surah 14, Ibrahim, and Surah 15, Al-Hijrah. Thank you for watching. May Allah accept our fasting. Assalamu alaikum.